Alright everyone, so first we're going to go over all of the products that I'm going to be using in this tutorial today. All products that you see are going to be from Sparkle & Company. So the first is going to be DP 173 Spiced Wine. This is a gorgeous, fiery glitter dip powder with a burgundy base. And then I'm also going to be using DP 90 Crystal Clear. Crystal clear is super important when you're working with any sort of glitter so that you can protect the glitter so that it doesn't lose its color once you're filing and shaping. I'm also going to be using all of the dip liquids by Sparkle & Co. This is number 2 Base Bond. The next liquid I'm going to be using is number 3 Solidify, and I apologize, my label came off. And I'm also going to be finishing this manicure with the Glossy 2.0 version. You'll notice at the end of this manicure that I'm going to finish with the Sparkle & Co. Cuticle oil. Just note that I also put it on all of the threading of the dip bottles so that none of them get stuck. Next, I'm going to go over a couple of additional supplies that might be a good idea to have around. Anytime I'm using a mini jar, just like this spice wine jar, I like to put it in a cupcake liner so that it catches any fallout of the dip and I can pour it back into the container. I'm also using your garden variety cuticle pusher. I'm going to be using this to pour my clear over so that I don't contaminate my entire container of clear. And probably the most important is a toothpick for those nice clean cuticle lines. I also highly recommend having either an old makeup brush or this nice big fluffy brush from Sparkle & Co. so that you can brush off the excess dip powder in between layers. Alright, and especially for our new dippers out there, I want to talk a little bit about angles when you're putting your finger into the powder. If you don't dip at an angle, then it's possible your liquids can get pushed up, causing a little bit of a ridge and potentially ruining your shape and smoothness of your nail at the end. So what I'm showing here is lifting up the cupcake liner to get this dip powder jar a little bit elevated and then placing my finger into the dip at a 45-degree angle so that we get a nice smooth shape. And if you don't want to lift up the cupcake liner, that's totally fine. Just again, make sure that you're trying to dip your finger in at an angle. Another option that I'm showing here is to place your finger on top of the dip powder and gently push it into the dip powder instead of dipping all the way in. Alright, let's go ahead and get started with the first coat. Since I like to build up my dip powder so that it doesn't end up being too thick at the cuticle line, for the first layer I'm just going to be doing a thin strip of base bond right down the center of the nail. I'm staying away from the cuticle line and away from the side walls prior to dipping into the powder. It's also really important that when using the base bond, you're keeping your layers really nice and thin so that we don't end up with a really thick manicure at the end. And after you're done with the first coat, make sure you take that fluffy brush and brush off any excess dip powder. And next we're going to go in with the second coat. I recommend going a little bit closer to the cuticle line, but you're still not going to go all the way to the cuticle line. You'll also notice that I'm still staying away from the sidewalls so that it doesn't get too thick around the edges. Keep in mind that it's really important, especially with working with glitters, to make sure that you brush off your base bond brush prior to putting it back in the bottle so that you don't contaminate the entire bottle of base bond with glitter. And after you're done with your second coat and your base bond is dried, we're going to take that fluffy brush once again and make sure we brush off any of the excess dip powder left over. So next I wanted to take a minute and talk about how we get those nice clean cuticle lines. You'll notice that before the third dip of dip powder, I've got a little bit of space on the sidewalls and the cuticle lines, and this is what we're going to be taking a little bit of extra time to fill. And just for the purposes of this tutorial, I switched out my base bond brush and I don't have any liquid on this nail art brush. I just wanted to show how I push the base bond liquid all the way to the cuticle line instead of starting at the cuticle line and working up. By taking a bead of the base bond and pushing it towards the cuticles, you get a little bit more control so that you don't flood the cuticle line. Next, we're going to do the third and final coat of the dip powder color. I recommend taking some extra time during this step and being really deliberate with where you place your base bond. By making sure your base bond is exactly where you want it before putting it into the dip powder, you're going to get a nice, clean, professional looking manicure at the end. And after the third dip, I recommend taking a toothpick like I'm showing here and just dragging it around your cuticle line to make sure that you pick up any excess base bond and dip powder, again for those nice clean cuticle lines. Make sure you're dusting off the excess powder at the end of your third dip, and then I wanted to take a second and talk about the thickness of the nail at the tip. Make sure that you're keeping your base bond layers really nice and thin so that we don't end up with an overwhelmingly thick nail. You can see that my pinky is a little bit thicker. That's because I actually have a tip on that nail from a break, but even with that extra added thickness, it's still at a manageable level. And like I said, the cupcake liner is a great hack for making sure it catches the fallout from the dip powder mini jar. That way you can just pour all the leftover dip powder back into the jar to get as many uses out of it as possible. Next, I'm going to do the final layer of dip with the DP90 Crystal Clear. Clear is super important when you're working with any sort of glitter so that your glitter doesn't get damaged when you're filing, buffing, and shaping. And I'm actually going to use another method for getting the clear onto my nail. Using a cuticle pusher, I'm going to be pouring the clear dip powder over so that I don't contaminate my entire jar of clear with any leftover glitters from my nails. As you can see, I'm using the cuticle pusher to scoop up the clear dip powder and sprinkle it on top of the base bond to get it onto the nail. I have the cupcake liner that I just used with the spice wine dip powder underneath to catch any fallout, and I'm going to use a toothpick around the cuticle line once again to make sure there's nothing left over. Once the final coat of dip powder is all done, make sure you dust off all 5 nails really well for any excess dip powder left over, and then do a nice healthy coat of solidify on all 5 nails. Since I'm not going to be showing my buffing and shaping process in this video, I did want to take a minute and just talk about what I normally do to buff and shape. All the nails, as you can see, are a little bit chunkier towards the cuticle end and do have some bumps and lumps in them. This is completely normal with the dip powder process, and this is why buffing is so important. Typically when I buff, I try and file in both of the edges as well as file straight across the top so that I can get a modified coffin shape on my short nails. To show you a little bit more in depth about what I mean, I like to take the nail file straight across the top and file a nice flat edge to get that nice square shape. Then when I'm filing on the sides, I'll do it in a tapered shape, filing towards the center of the nail to get that modified coffin that I mean. I also use an E-file to smooth everything out. The bit that I'm showing you is a fine grit tungsten bit, and I use it in quick swipes moving up toward the top of the nail to smooth out any lumps and bumps. And once I'm all done with the E-file, I'll go back in with a hand buffing block just to get everything nice and smooth prior to moving on to the next step. I also wanted to take a minute and talk about the importance of washing your hands after you're done buffing. This is what my hands look like once I'm done filing, shaping, and buffing, and as you can see, there's a lot of leftover debris and dip powder dust that we want to make sure we get off. Now that all the buffing and shaping is done, you can see that my nails look a lot smoother. They're not as chunky at the cuticle line, and we're shaping up to have a nice, clean, finished manicure. After all of your buffing is done, you're going to go in with a second coat of Solidify on all 5 nails. And after your second coat of Solidify is done, I recommend leaving a couple of minutes for Solidify to dry and then wiping off any excess with a lint-free paper towel or cloth. Then you're going to use Glossy Coat. Here I'm using the Glossy Coat 2.0, and as you can see for the first coat, I'm trying to keep it to 3 quick swipes on each nail. This is because Solidify is a drying agent, so the more you go over it with the Glossy Coat is going to try and dry, which causes streakiness that we don't want. Usually by the time I finish my second hand with the first coat of Glossy Coat, my first hand is already dry, so once that has happened, you can go ahead and go in with the second coat of Glossy Coat, and that's going to finish the manicure. With your second coat, you can take a little bit more time, but I still recommend trying to keep it to 3 or 4 quick swipes, and make sure you cap the free edges for a long-lasting manicure. And once your Glossy Coat is dry, make sure that you rehydrate your cuticles with some cuticle oil, and then your manicure will be all finished. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that this tutorial was helpful, and feel free to ask any questions in the comments down below. Take care.